It is August in North Carolina. The temperature has not dropped below 90 degrees in 3 weeks. Every garden on the road leading to her property is yellowing, wilting, curling up at the edges the way plants do when they have already given up. Hers is not. Her tomato plants are shoulder height, loaded with fruit. Her squash vines are sprawling across beds so dark and moist they look almost black. She has not touched a hose since early June. I asked her what she was doing differently. She looked at me like the answer was obvious. She said 4 words that sound like a mistake, like something you would call someone to warn against. She said, "I bury the wood." That is it. That is all she said. Now here is what I want you to understand before we go any further. The average American vegetable garden uses over 1,400 gallons of water every single growing season. The seed catalog does not mention that. Neither does the garden center. And the idea that a garden simply needs to be watered, that it is just part of the deal, is not a fact of nature. It is something we were taught recently by people who had something to sell. What that woman in North Carolina was doing, what her grandmother taught her, what farmers in the mountains of Europe and the river valleys of North America figured out centuries before any of us were born. It rewrites everything most of us believe about how soil actually works. Stay with me until the end, because what happens underground in year 3 is the part that changes everything, and nobody talks about it. Let me ask you something. Think about the last full week of July in your garden. What were you doing every other morning before the day got going? You were watering. And the morning after that? Watering again. And every time you missed a day, you could see it in the leaves by evening. That soft, downward curl, that pale, tired green that means the plant is already rationing. Most of us accept that as part of the deal. Gardening means watering. That is just how it works, except it is not, and it never used to be. The average American vegetable garden goes through somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 gallons of water in a single growing season. That is not a number you will find on the back of a seed packet. It is not mentioned at the garden center. It just becomes part of your life. The hose, the timer, the slow anxiety every time a dry week stretches into 2. And when the drought stress hits anyway, when the tomatoes crack and the zucchini goes bitter, the advice is always the same. Water more deeply. Water less frequently. Try a soaker hose. Try mulching. Buy this. What nobody says is that the need for all of that watering is not a fact of nature. It is a design flaw. A flaw in the way the soil was built, or more accurately, the way it was never built at all. Here is something that might stop you cold. For most of human history, home kitchen gardens did not get watered. Not regularly, not with any kind of system. A 19th century homesteader growing food for her family relied almost entirely on rainfall, and she expected her soil to hold that rainfall long enough to carry her plants through the dry stretches in between. If a garden needed constant watering to survive, that was not considered normal. It was considered a warning. It meant the soil had lost something it was supposed to have. Something was wrong, and the answer was to fix the ground, not drag out a bucket. That understanding did not disappear because someone proved it wrong. It disappeared because someone figured out how to profit from its absence. After World War II, the companies that had been manufacturing chemicals for the war effort needed new markets. They found them in agriculture. And over the following 2 decades, the entire system of how Americans learned to garden was quietly rebuilt around purchased inputs, fertilizer from a bag, pesticides from a bottle, an irrigation infrastructure that turned a design failure in the soil into a permanent fixture of the hobby. A garden that could water itself from the ground up was not a customer, so nobody taught you how to build one. But some people never forgot, and in the mountains of Central Europe, in communities that had been farming the same steep, rocky hillsides for centuries without the option of buying anything, that knowledge had been sitting in the soil the whole time, waiting, buried, you might say, under everything that came after. Picture a mountain farm in Austria in the early 1800s. No hardware store, no garden center, no bags of fertilizer stacked by the door. Just steep rocky slopes, short growing seasons, and families who had been coaxing food out of that unforgiving ground for generations. These were not people who could afford to fail, and they did not fail. They built some of the most productive kitchen gardens in Europe, and the secret was underneath the surface the whole time. The technique is called Hugelkultur. It is a German word, and it means hill culture. The idea is simple enough to explain in one sentence, but rich enough to take a lifetime to fully understand. You dig a trench, fill it with logs and rotting branches, cover it with soil and compost, and then you plant on top. That is it. That is the whole thing. Except what happens next is anything but simple. Those Central European mountain farmers were not the only ones who figured this out. On the other side of the world, in the river valleys of the Mississippi, Native American farming communities were building elevated planting mounds filled with buried organic material long before any European had set foot on the continent. The early settlers who encountered these mounds wrote about them with obvious envy. The yields were remarkable. The soil was dark and alive in a way that the settlers could not replicate no matter how hard they tried. They did not understand the mechanism. They just knew the results were better than anything they were producing on flat, unburied ground. Two completely separate civilizations, on opposite sides of the planet, arrived at the same solution independently. That is not a coincidence. That is nature showing you the answer twice. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, that answer was quietly set aside, not disproven, not replaced by something better, just quietly moved out of the way. After World War II, as chemical companies reshaped the agricultural landscape and university extension programs began teaching the gardening methods that aligned with the products those companies were selling, techniques that required no purchases simply stopped being passed down. They were not forbidden, they were just never mentioned. A garden that feeds and waters itself from the inside is not something you can sell. So nobody put it in the curriculum. Now here is where the story takes a turn that I find genuinely remarkable. In the 1960s, an Austrian farmer named Sepp Holzer was growing citrus fruit on a mountain. Not in a greenhouse, not in a valley. On an open hillside at 5,000 feet elevation, in a region where winter temperatures regularly drop well below freezing. Lemons, oranges, growing outside in the Alps. His Hugelkultur beds were generating enough warmth and holding enough moisture to make it possible. When government agricultural officials came to see what he was doing, they did not send a research team, they sent a fine. He was penalized for farming outside of approved methods. They could see what the beds were doing, they just could not explain it. And here is the part that keeps this story moving, because those beds were not just holding water the way a bucket holds water. They were producing something from the inside, something measurable, something that showed up in the instruments when scientists finally thought to look, something that changed what researchers believed about what soil actually is. So what were those beds actually doing? What was the thing the officials could see but could not explain? What was showing up in the instruments when scientists finally decided to look? To understand it, you need to think about wood differently than you probably do right now. When you look at a log, you see something solid, something hard and dense. But wood is not solid at the cellular level. It is a network of tiny tubes and chambers that the tree built over decades to move water from the roots up to the leaves. Every ring you see in a cross-section of a trunk is a year of those tubes being laid down, and when a tree dies and that wood begins to soften and break down, those tubes do not disappear, they stay open, and in moist soil they fill up. A piece of buried, decomposing hardwood will absorb and hold 4 to 5 times its own dry weight in water. Think about what that means for a raised bed. A bed with a solid layer of buried logs and branches at its base is not sitting on dirt. It is sitting on a cistern, a distributed underground water tank that fills up every time it rains and releases that water slowly back into the root zone during every dry stretch that follows. No pump, no timer, no water bill. The reservoir is built into the ground itself. That alone would be enough to explain why those old mountain gardens survived dry summers that killed everything around them. But that is only the beginning of what is happening down there. As the wood decomposes, it does not decompose alone. Fungi move in. And this is where the story shifts from interesting to genuinely remarkable. Fungal networks are the hidden infrastructure of healthy soil. A single cubic foot of buried wood in active decomposition can support a fungal network that spreads outward through 20 or more square feet of surrounding soil. Those networks are not just sitting there, they are working. They thread through the soil in hair-thin strands called hyphae, and those strands connect to the roots of the plants growing above them. Through those connections, the fungi act as a delivery system, pulling water and minerals from deep in the decomposing wood and passing them directly to the plant roots that need them. It is like the plants have tapped into a supply line that runs far deeper than their own roots could ever reach. But here is the part that stopped researchers cold when they first documented it. Those fungal networks do not just move resources, they transmit signals. When one plant in a Hugelkultur bed comes under stress from drought or pest pressure, it sends a chemical signal through the fungal network. The other plants in the bed receive that signal and begin adjusting their own chemistry in response, preparing for what is coming before it arrives. The plants are, in a very real sense, talking to each other. Through the wood, through the fungi, living in the wood, underground, quietly, in a language we are only just beginning to translate. A conventional raised bed filled with purchased soil and watered from the top does not have this. It cannot. There is nothing buried beneath it to host the network. The plants in that bed are entirely on their own, each one isolated, each one depending entirely on whatever water and nutrients the gardener provides from above. Now add one more layer to this picture. As the wood decomposes, it generates heat, not a lot, just 1 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit above the surrounding soil temperature. That does not sound like much until you are a gardener in a cold climate staring at a forecast with a late frost in it. 1 to 3 degrees in early spring is the difference between planting in April and waiting until May. In zones 4 and 5, that thermal output from the decomposing wood can extend your growing season by 2 to 3 weeks on the front end of the year. Weeks you did not have before. Weeks that cost you nothing and came from burying branches that would otherwise have gone to the curb. And the nutrients. The wood does not release everything at once the way a bag of synthetic fertilizer does, of flooding the soil with more than the plant can use, and washing the rest away. It releases slowly, across years, calibrated by the pace of decomposition to roughly match the pace of plant growth. The soil feeds the plant the way a good meal feeds a person, steadily, over time, in amounts the system can actually absorb and use. This is the underground engine. Water storage, fungal delivery networks, heat generation, slow nutrient release, and interplant communication, all running simultaneously, all powered by a pile of old wood that most people would have shredded or burned. Now here is the thing about the year 3 timeline that matters more than anything else in this video, because the transformation that happens between year 1 and year 3 is not a gradual improvement. It is a threshold. Something tips over, and once it does, the gardener's role in the system shifts in a way that most people genuinely struggle to believe until they are standing in their own bed watching it happen. But before you get there, you need to know exactly what to put in the ground. Because one mistake, one wrong piece of wood, can shut the whole system down for 2 full years before it ever gets started. So let us talk about what actually goes in the ground. Because this is the part where most people make the mistake that costs them a full growing season before they understand what went wrong. The best wood you can bury is the wood that already looks like it is halfway to becoming soil, aged hardwood that has been sitting on the ground for a season or 2, wood that has gone soft at the edges, wood with a little surface mold on it. Oak is excellent. Apple and pear are exceptional. Poplar, maple, any fruit tree pruning you have sitting in a pile from last winter's trim. That white or gray fuzz you see on the surface is not something to scrape off before you bury it. That fuzz is the fungal inoculant. It is the beginning of the network. It is exactly what you want going into the bed first. The layering sequence matters. The largest, densest logs go at the bottom. They are your long-term water storage and your heat source. Above that, smaller branches and sticks break down faster and feed the middle layers of the root zone more quickly. Then a generous covering of aged compost and good topsoil, deep enough that your plants have something rich to establish in while the wood below begins its work. Now here is the thing conventional gardening wisdom gets partially right. Fresh green wood does temporarily bind nitrogen as it decomposes. It pulls nitrogen out of the surrounding soil before it has finished breaking down, which can starve young plants of what they need early in the season. That is a real effect, and it is the reason most gardening books tell you to keep wood out of your beds entirely. But that warning applies to fresh wood. Partially rotted wood does not do this. The decomposition process that causes nitrogen binding has already begun and largely passed. This single distinction, fresh versus aged, is the entire difference between a bed that thrives in year 1 and a bed that struggles and leaves you convinced the whole idea was wrong. Here is something that stopped me when I first came across it. The dimensions that work best for this kind of bed, 4 feet wide, 2 to 3 feet tall, or running as long as your space allows, were not figured out by anyone in the modern permaculture movement. They match almost exactly the dimensions of raised beds described in Central European agricultural literature from the 1600s. Farmers who had never heard of soil science, who had no instruments and no university training, arrived at the same numbers through nothing but generations of watching what worked. And they got it right. Now there is one more thing you need to know before you dig. A short list of woods that do not just fail in this system, they actively destroy it, and one of them is probably growing in your neighborhood right now. Black walnut releases a compound called juglone into the soil, and it is toxic to most vegetable crops even after the wood has fully decomposed. Cedar and eucalyptus contain natural oils that kill the fungal networks the entire system depends on. Treated lumber, railroad ties, anything painted or stained, these do not break down into nutrients. They break down into chemistry your plants cannot survive. Bury the right wood and something begins happening around month 6 that no gardening book published before 1990 mentions. Not because it was not happening in those old mountain beds, because nobody had the tools to see it yet. By year 3, what is living inside that bed is something most gardeners spend their entire lives trying to build from the outside and never quite reach. That is where we are going next. And it changes what the word gardening actually means. So here is what happens in year 3. The logs at the base of the bed are gone. Not rotted away to nothing, but transformed. What is sitting in the lower half of that bed by year 3 is no longer wood in any structural sense. It is mycelium, a continuous living fungal mat that threads through the entire depth of the bed and reaches outward into the soil beyond its edges. If you could pull the bed apart and hold a handful of that material up to the light, you would see it. White threads running through dark matter in every direction, dense as a sponge, alive in a way that purchased potting mix never is and never can be. The gardener did not build this. The gardener built the conditions in which it built itself. That is a distinction that matters more than it might seem. Because by year 3, the plants in that bed are not eating what the gardener put in. They are eating what the fungal network is delivering. And every morning while you are still inside drinking your coffee, that network is mining phosphorus and calcium and trace minerals from the last remnants of decomposing wood below, trading those minerals to the plant roots above in exchange for the carbon sugars the leaves produce through photosynthesis. It is a barter economy running 24 hours a day, 6 feet underground, requiring nothing from you. No input, no amendment, no intervention of any kind. This is what the woman in Asheville inherited from her grandmother. Not a trick, not a shortcut, a relationship. A relationship between the buried wood and the fungi and the roots and the soil that takes 3 years to fully form and then runs on its own for 20 years after that. The hose you drag out every other morning is not a gardening tool. It is the thing you use when this relationship does not exist. It is the workaround, and the material you need to build the relationship is already in your yard right now. That pile of branches behind the shed that has been sitting since last fall. That log you rolled to the side of the lawn 2 summers ago. The apple tree prunings bundled and forgotten by the fence. They've been sitting there quietly, softening, inoculating themselves with exactly the fungal species that'll colonize a buried bed. They have been getting ready. You just did not know what they were getting ready for. Before I left her property that afternoon, the woman in Asheville told me one more thing. She said her grandmother had always called the buried wood the part of the garden that does the work while you sleep. She did not know the word mycelium. She did not know anything about fungal networks or moisture ratios or threshold events in soil biology. She just knew that you bury the wood, you leave it alone, and eventually the garden stops needing you as much as it used to. She said that like it was the whole point. I have been thinking about that ever since, and I am fairly sure it is. Go look at what is decomposing in your yard right now. You might already have everything you need. If this changed how you think about the ground beneath your garden, leave a comment and tell me what you are going to bury first. And subscribe, because there are more stories like this one. Forgotten techniques, buried knowledge, things that worked for centuries before someone decided there was more money in making you forget them. I will see you in the next one.